Hello, my name's Cliff Freilich. I'm the Executive Director of Cinema St. Louis, and we are the presenters of the 29th Annual Whitaker St. Louis International Film Festival. We're delighted to be joined by the director of the terrific documentary Waging Change. She is a multiple time alum of SLIF, Abby Ginzberg. So we're happy to have her. We're even more excited. We've seen Abby, so she's old hat to us.
Yeah.
But we are really excited to have one of the subjects of the film, Saru Jayarama, who is the co-founder of Restaurant Opportunity Centers United and the president of One Fair Wage. And she has a very prominent role in the film and gives voice to a lot of the things that the film is talking about. So let's get right to it. Let's start with you, Abby, and tell us a little bit about the evolution of this film. Was this a film that came to you, somebody said you need to make this film and hired you, or is this a film that was very much originated with you?
Originated with me. What happened was I heard Saru speak very briefly, 15 minutes, but she packs a lot in 15 minutes. And I had that experience that filmmakers have where your hands start to sweat and your heartbeat goes up and you realize, oh my God, this might be my next film. And what I realized was because I didn't really know anything about the tip minimum wage. And I think of myself as somebody who's relatively well educated about labor issues. As I heard Saru speak, I thought, well, if I don't know about the tip minimum wage, there have got to be millions of other people, particularly in tip minimum wage states, who also don't know about it. And that was what, kind of launched me on the journey to both learn more about it myself, figure out how to make a film that would teach other people about it, and become kind of immersed in this movement that Saru has been part of literally since 9/11, about trying to both end the tip minimum wage and talk about what it takes to create one fair wage in this country for low wage workers. So I basically launched and sustained this project for probably close to 4 years, until we had a finished film.
Great. Saru, if you would talk just a little bit about your sort of origin story with regard to how you became committed to this particular fight. And then we'll talk a little bit about how hopeful you're feeling at this stage after having fought for it for so long.
Yeah. So I started this journey on 9/11, actually September 11th, 2001. On that morning, about 73 restaurant workers died at Windows on the World, which was the restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center, Tower One. And about 13,000 workers lost their jobs in New York City in the months and weeks following the tragedy. It was a moment kind of eerily similar to this moment. Workers had lost their jobs, restaurants closed, people had died. But out of the ashes, tragedy, which I believe is possible for this moment too, we built this center fighting for the rights of low wage restaurant workers in New York City, and it grew nationally. And as it grew, we learned the horrific situation facing really what is now the nation's second largest private sector workforce and number one lowest paying workforce in America, which is the restaurant industry. 13.6 million workers nationwide, but unfortunately continues to be the lowest paid, largely because of this history that Abby shares in the movie. That in fact, there's a sub minimum wage for tipped workers, still $2.13 an hour. That is a literal legacy of slavery. It started with the restaurant lobby, now called the National Restaurant Association. We call it the other NRA. It represents the chains, the IHOPs, the Applebee's. But its predecessor, basically at emancipation, demanding the right to hire newly freed slaves, mostly Black women at the time, and not pay them anything and have them live entirely on tips. So we've gone from a $0 wage at emancipation all the way up to the ridiculous wage of $2.13 an hour over 150 years. It's time for the country to really walk away from these horrific legacies of slavery. And we're talking about not a sliver of the workforce, we're talking about the nation's largest industry. And after the film was finished, the pandemic, of course, happened, and everything we talked about in the film just became so obvious. I had so many people tell me, I bet you're saying I told you so, because it became so apparent to everybody how huge this industry is, how much we rely on it, how not resilient the industry has been, how much these workers were on the brink, living, as we call it, tip to mouth. About, between 6 and 9 million restaurant workers lost their jobs post-pandemic or experienced some form of underemployment, and 60% of them, 60, couldn't access unemployment insurance because of the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. They were told in most states. In the film, you see these workers organizing and fighting to raise their wages. In many states, legislators overturning their wins. And then imagine workers organized to raise their wage from $2 or $3 to $12 or $15. They win. The legislature puts them back at $3, $4, $5. And then 6 months later tells them, sorry, your wages are too low. You can't access unemployment insurance. And now you're left with literally millions of workers facing homelessness and starvation, stealing food for their children because they have no choice. And now being asked to go back to work because indoor dining has started in much of the country. Now being asked to go back to work and risk their lives for a sub-minimum wage when tips are down across the country 50 to 75%. And they're being asked to enforce social distancing and mask rules with the very same customers from whom they're trying to get tips to survive. It's a public health disaster. We just got back results of 1,000 surveys from workers across the country, and a vast majority are saying, I cannot enforce these public health rules because I need to get tips from these customers. And the belligerence they're facing from customers when they try to enforce these rules is a clear indication that if they try to enforce these rules, they're not going to get tips. So if we want these workers to enforce these public health rules, if we want indoor dining to not cause another huge spike of COVID-19, we need to pay them a full minimum wage. So I guess I would say, to answer your question, for all of these reasons, this issue has gone from an issue of economic justice, racial justice, social justice, to being an issue of life or death, literally, for millions of workers and for any one of us that wants to eat out in the next year. We need to care about this issue.
Yeah, you've already obviously unpacked a lot of what I was going to explore later with regard to the current situation with the pandemic, which obviously has only compounded all the problems that already existed for these workers. Abby, let's turn back to you a little bit. This film's only 61 minutes, and yet you pack an enormous, just like Saru packs into her presentations, a lot of
Okay, I
information.
learned from the best.
You do the same, because you don't just focus. I mean, that's the primary aspect of the film, obviously, about the tip minimum wage and its appalling, minuscule aspect of what these folks get paid. But you also deal with a lot of other issues that cluster around restaurant work, including racial issues, particularly the sexual harassment and things of that nature that occur, the power of the NRA. So how did you decide to strike that balance? It must have been hard.
One of the things that happens when you work on a film over a course of several years, I mean, it's sort of like the same thing, and then the pandemic hits. So you're really forced to follow certain things in real time. And so the Me Too movement happened after I started this film. So there is this big demonstration in Washington, and Saru and a bunch of restaurant workers are all speaking at this big Women's Day rally, etc. But the reason that had happened is because the Me Too movement had been kicked off, say, 6 to 9 months before that. And that empowered and enabled more and more restaurant workers, most women restaurant workers, basically are told to and have to suck it up when they experience harassment. And if they, bother to tell their boss about it, the message is, you don't like it, go somewhere else. So the Me Too movement provided some sort of national understanding of what was happening, not just in the restaurant industry, but in the restaurant industry, among others, and enabled us to, we both had more restaurant workers who were willing to talk about it, and we began to have a little bit of a national reckoning around this. So when that happens around a worker's issue, it empowers everybody to be stronger, to stand up, to say, I'm not taking this anymore. And that was what I would say happened. I could have talked about sexual harassment in the restaurant industry without any of the pushing back that we saw from people in the film. And that would have been a movement that had yet to happen. But with Me Too coming to the fore when it did, there's a synergistic effect between what was happening with Me Too, people being willing to speak out, really, well-known fancy chefs being called to account for their outrageous behavior all across the country. And we name a few of them in the film just to sort of say, well, you may have heard of these guys, and this is what they were doing to their workers. So that, I would say, worked for the film, and to sort of help people understand what was going on in the country as a whole around issues of sexual harassment. Then you have a second theme or a second set of themes, which had to do with democracy. And that really had to do with the fact that I was so angry when I saw what had happened both in DC and in Michigan, where you sort of, where you win the fight, and then some elected officials just decide they're just not going to honor it, and they repeal popularly elected initiatives. Well, that didn't sit very well with me. So that was another, just like the tip minimum wage didn't sit very well with me. I felt like I had to follow those stories to some kind of an ending so that we understood that people weren't going to take that sitting down. And there was going to be some resistance to what the DC City Council did. And that's sort of an ongoing fight, as some of the people who ended up repealing Initiative 77 are now in the process of being replaced on the City Council, through voter activities, et cetera. So this is, when you are telling a story in real time, either about an individual or about a movement or about an issue, you don't know when you start what it's not even the rabbit holes. You don't even know what the roads are that you're going to be going down, because they change. And having a certain amount of nimbleness as a filmmaker and willingness to say, okay, this is like the democracy issue for me. This is a big enough issue for me to kind of figure out how I'm going to fit it into the film, becomes very important. And that, let me say, I have another film that I did about Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Well, I finished that film before everybody took to the streets with Black Lives Matter and George Floyd being killed. And she's leading the opposition in Congress on many levels to what's going on there. You have to put that into the film, even if you do it at the last minute. So for all of us who are, hopefully truth-telling storytellers, we are doing our best to keep a film as, kind of contemporary as possible, and to follow stories to wherever their natural conclusion is. And I would say the point for your viewers is this is an ongoing story. Should we be lucky enough to take the Senate? One would hope that raising the minimum wage and ending the tip minimum wage would be at the top of the economic agenda of a newly elected Democratic Senate. And the movement that Saru is leading, and me as a filmmaker, will be pushing for that in any way that we can. And keeping a movie to 61 minutes, this is sort of my new thing. It's like, this was before the pandemic, before we all had really short attention spans, but I felt like less is more. And if I can sort of keep it moving, keep this train moving, so people are like interested, and we're going to the next place, and we're leaving Washington, and now we're going to Michigan, whatever, that if I could do it in 61 minutes, I would be doing the audience a service, as opposed to making them sit there for 82 minutes. And part of the reason is that under normal circumstances, you want to be able to have a Q&A. We're now in a world where the Q&A comes beforehand, but the goal was to enable people to have the whole experience in, say, under 75 minutes. So you could do the Q&A and show the film in a reasonable amount of time. So, and we have done, for people who are interested in this, through One Fair Wage, we have segmented little pieces of the film so that you can tell a mini story like the legacy of slavery and how the tip minimum wage is connected to that, and find it on YouTube. So we are trying to make the information that is embedded in this film available to as broad an audience as possible.
And enable them to use it in an activist fashion in order to promote the change in their own locale. Saru, Abby mentions the notion of hoped for change in the minimum wage for other workers as well. So these two things work to some degree in concert, obviously. Can you talk a little bit about how those two things intertwine, the tip minimum wage and also, the minimum wage for other workers, and some of them in the restaurant industry, obviously the fast food workers in particular are affected by this?
Yeah. So, I mean, we had been part of the coalition to raise the overall minimum wage for all workers prior to the Fight for 15 emerging. When the Fight for 15 emerged, it started with fast food workers, it grew to include other workers. And unfortunately, it wasn't, it wasn't fought for or built as a coalition effort the same way in every state. In the 7 states that had one fair wage, like California, $15 meant 15 for everybody because tipped workers already received the full minimum wage. Unfortunately, in the 43 states with a sub minimum wage, many of those states actually had $15 fights, Fight for 15, threw a lot of energy into moving $15 as the minimum wage in many of those states. And unfortunately, in every single one of those states, tipped workers were left out. And so we have spent the last 5 or 6 years trying to correct that, trying to go back and make sure tipped workers get included in the $15 minimum wage in many of these states that passed it. In some states where $15 didn't pass, we're trying to fight together for both $15 and a full minimum wage for tipped workers. But just like we felt left out as tipped workers over the years by many of these state fights, we realized last year when we had our biggest victory, working with others to pass the Raise the Wage Act in the House of Representatives that called for 15 and full elimination, not only of the subminimum wage for tipped workers, but also the subminimum wage for workers with disabilities. At that point, we kind of realized, we are not the only ones being excluded. Other tipped workers have been excluded, but also other subminimum wage workers have been excluded. So we're obviously restaurant workers are not the only tipped workers with a subminimum wage. There's also nail salon and car wash, airport attendants, parking attendants that get this $2 wage. And then beyond those workers, gig workers in the millions have now have no minimum wage, have been getting tips, and in many cases, companies like DoorDash have attempted to take cuts from their workers' payments based on how much they got tips. So essentially emulating the sub minimum wage for tipped workers in the gig sector as well. And then beyond workers with disabilities who get a sub minimum wage, incarcerated workers are one of the largest groups getting a sub minimum wage because of the exception to the 13th Amendment that allows for slavery in the case of incarceration. And so we grew our campaign last year to say, you know what? No worker should be left behind. All workers deserve one fair wage, a full minimum wage. Nobody should be paid less than the minimum wage when they work. And in fact, anybody being paid less than the minimum wage when they work hurts all of us because it drags down the overall wage floor for everybody else. And it creates an unfair competition between the fast food employers who are paying a full minimum wage and the full service restaurants that are paying $2. We need to create one level minimum wage for every worker that works in this country. And our fight as tipped workers has been the first push really to get rid of these exclusions, but we see it as only the first, not the last. We need to keep fighting until every worker in America gets paid a full minimum wage. After all, that's what a minimum wage was intended to be, right? A minimum wage. And the fact that 1/10 of our economy can legally be paid below that needs to go.
And just so people know in Missouri what the tip minimum wage is, I just looked it up. And you can look this up if you're from some other state. You just literally Google, what is the tip minimum wage in my state? In Missouri, it's $4.72 or $4.725 or whatever, because the minimum wage in Missouri is $9.45. So there's a lot of work to be done in Missouri to improve things, given that in California, the minimum wage in many cities, at least where we live, is $15. So, Missouri is trailing badly.
Well, as it does, unfortunately, in so many areas, including the overturning of the people's votes with regard to various initiatives. It's unfortunate that the legislature chooses to sort of go their own way and ignore the people's will. Now, obviously, it's a much larger fight, as Saru talked about, with regard to making certain everybody receives a fair wage. But with regard to the specific restaurant issue, do you think that part of the solution is this movement toward a salary to your people as opposed to any sort of dependence on tipping?
Well, no,
No. Go ahead.
all right. Let me just say, we're not against tipping.
Mhm.
So Saru, take it from there. But let's be
Yeah.
clear, we are not talking about ending tipping.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, tipping originated in feudal Europe as an extra or bonus on top of a wage. And in much of Europe now, there's much more of a sentiment that we are professionals. We don't need your tips. Tips can be paid. It's not like it's illegal or prohibited to pay tips to workers in Europe, but they're negligible. They're an extra or bonus on top of the wage. Workers can rely and count on a professional income from their employers. And so that's really where we're headed. We're agnostic as to whether there are tips on top or not. To us, they just should not be the primary source of income for any worker. They're not reliable. Unfortunately, there are now mountains of evidence that they are extremely biased, racist, sexist. They are a reflection of American biases. So women make less in tips than men, even if they're better servers. People of color make far less than white
Right.
workers, even if they're better servers, even if they're standing right side by side at a fine dining restaurant and the person of color is a better server, they're going to earn less in tip. So it's not that we think all tipping should be eliminated. It's that tipping should not be the primary source of income. The primary source of income for any worker in any business should be an employer paying the worker for the value of their labor, rather than having customers somehow compensate workers for the value of their labor. It is the employer who is profiting from the value of those workers' labor. They need to pay for it, like every other worker, every other employer in every other industry. So, what we're fighting for is a livable wage for all workers from their employer. And some employers have said, okay, well, I'm going to go all the way and provide a professional salary and no tips. And we support that. But we also support employers who want to just pay a full livable wage and let tipping exist on top of that. As long as the tips are not the primary source of income, they're an addition or a supplement.
So I felt like, let me just say this about that. I always felt like the big aha moment here was, for me, just learning about this when I first started out, was I thought workers were paid the minimum wage. And when I found out that they weren't, I was appalled. Okay, so then I start working on this and I talked to, many people who are just restaurant consumers. And of course, they also thought that workers were paid the minimum wage and our tip was a gratuity to thank people for having served us. When people find out that these workers are actually living off their tips, that that the tiny little base pay that they're getting is not anything like what they need in order to pay for food for their families, most people are shocked. We say it in the film, but I want to say it's been my experience over the last 4 or 5 years that people are truly shocked to find out that their tips make up the worker's wage, as opposed to being a sort of thank you for, as I say, serving us. And that is part of the educational impact of this film, is to educate people about how these workers are actually paid. So if you think, someone didn't serve you quite well enough or something, and you cheat that, you're cheap on your tip, it's making a huge difference in the lives of somebody who's relying on that tip in order to feed their family. So I just want to sort of stress that most restaurant consumers have no idea that their tips are making up part of the worker's minimum wage. It's like people can't even wrap their minds around it.
Particularly given the almost absurdly, well, it is absurdly low federal minimum, $2.13. I mean, no one would dream that is the the tip minimum wage until you're told flat out, such as in your film, that that's the case. So most people would not even contemplate that that could be a possibility. So yeah, it's a very educational aspect that you're serving here with the film. And obviously
Yeah.
Saru's been doing that for a long time now, making certain that people are aware of the inequities that are built in to the restaurant industry. It always struck me too that I always felt particularly bad for restaurant workers in places like a Waffle House, that you're not going to be spending a lot of money on your meal, and you're still doing your little calculation with regard to what you're going to leave behind as a tip. And if they're receiving that same pitiful minimum, they're really going to be in astonishingly bad shape. All of the restaurant workers are having a hard time, but presumably there's a sort of like an upper tier working in fancier restaurants that have the ability to perhaps earn a closer to near livable wage. But those folks are really in terrible shape.
True that. I just want to share one thing. Okay, so this was like another thing that sort of smacked me between the eyes. The film was in the Omaha Film Festival right before we shut down for the pandemic. And I went out to a Waffle House type place. And I said to the waitress, I just started talking to the waitress about what do you get paid in Omaha, or Nebraska is a 213 state. And she starts talking and she said, well, the reason I work at the Waffle House or whatever the place was on the weekends is because I have to supplement my income as a teacher. She was a teacher of disabled students, and she did not make enough money from her teacher job. So she is supplementing it with, this pathetic wage that she gets from the Waffle House. And the good news is that at that point in time, anyway, there was a lot of turnover. So she at least had a lot of tables to work with. But that's, that is another sort of outrageous fact of life. So again, I would encourage, people who are watching the film or listening to this Q&A to engage in a conversation with your servers, because you will learn a lot. Most people are happy to talk to you if you know enough to just mention the tip minimum wage and get going on a conversation. I've learned a lot from servers across the country as I was making this film. So I encourage consumers to open up that dialogue with their servers.
So let's return to the current situation that we're all facing with the pandemic. Obviously, yes, there are some restaurants throughout the country that are reopening for dining inside. On the other hand, because of the spikes that are occurring in many places now, whereas they could sort of survive from the point of view of having outdoor dining, now as bad weather starts to manifest in much of the country, and they aren't allowed to go in, these folks are going to be in even more desperate shape because they're just not going to have any work. Are you hopeful at this point, or are you really highly concerned about the status of things right now?
I'm both. We're facing a very, very severe crisis that gets worse every day. And at the same time, that crisis has created enormous opportunity for change. And we've seen thousands of workers and restaurant owners who opposed us on this issue, independent restaurant owners, not chains, really change their mind on the issue. So on the crisis side, I just, as I mentioned, workers are being asked to go back to work for a sub-minimum wage when tips are down 50 to 75%. They're being asked to risk their lives, to get very little in tips and not enough in wages. And so a lot of them are choosing not to go back to work. They're saying, I won't do it. I won't risk my family's life for a $2 wage. And that has resulted in a lot of employers having to pay the full minimum wage, and many of them coming to us and asking how to do it, wanting to be part of an association of employers that are doing it. We now have 800 restaurants that are transitioning to one fair wage. It's been a moment of real, incredible change, real opportunity for change. But the crisis is so severe, more severe than most people think. And as I was saying earlier, it's not a crisis just for workers, it's a crisis for all of us, because In September, the CDC reported that adults are twice as likely to get coronavirus from eating in a restaurant. So we rely on these workers to enforce these social distancing and mask rules. But a majority of workers have reported to us that they cannot and will not enforce these rules. A, because they have to get tips from those same customers to survive, and B, because the customers have been so belligerent about it. And frankly, the belligerence around mask rules has compounded with sexual harassment. So that just today I was reading through, I'm going to share with you some of these horrific comments from customers that workers reported being told, um, take off your mask so I can see your looks and decide how much to tip you. Lots of women are reporting that they're being asked to take off their mask so the customers can judge their looks and therefore determine their tip on that basis. These are quotes from workers. Said he would have tipped me better if I didn't have a mask on, asking to see my face because then they can tell if I'm pretty, feeling like my tips are dependent on complying but not wanting to risk my personal safety. Customer said, I'll take your mask off and stick my tongue down your throat. The guest wanted me to give him a peek at my face, asking that I pull my mask down in the dining room. When I told him no, I'm not allowed to do that, he became more insistent, saying things like, no one will notice, and I want to see the face of the girl that gave me great service. I bet you're so hot under that mask. I wouldn't be able to stay 6 feet from you. Come back to my place. We don't have to wear masks. Take off your mask. I want to see what's underneath. Want to see your pretty face. Take it off. It's just on and on and on. It's kind of so disgusting. I need to stop. But
I
this
don't want
is
to X-rate this Q&A.
exactly. It's just outrageous. And as I said, what was a gender, racial, and economic justice prior to the pandemic is now an issue of life or death. Those workers take off their masks, they die, the customers die. That's the situation we're facing right now.
Yeah, and of course, obviously, the lack of political will to actually enforce mandatory mask wearing is one of the reasons why those workers are being asked to enforce the rules as
That's
opposed
right.
to the larger societal structure helping out.
But,
Well, on that depressing note,
but
Abby,
let me
would you like to bring us home with something a little bit
Well,
more hopeful?
I was just gonna say, I feel like these issues are not automatically apparent. So if you're in a place as an individual or part of a family where you're like, I am so sick of the pandemic and of masks and so on, what Saru is calling out and what we are asking people to do is to understand the larger picture in which all of this is taking place. So that even if you're frustrated, do not take out your frustration or your hostility or your sexual harassing behavior on your server. These people are trying to make your life better. And all the stuff that Saru just read, you would hope wouldn't be happening, but it's happening all across the country. And so part of our ask to people who may be seeing this Q&A, is to understand this set of issues, to talk to other people about it. I mean, I feel like this film permits us to be in a situation, of each one teach one. It's like if you learn something new, different, and motivating for you as a result of listening to us and watching the film, please, this is information that is easily shareable with the people that you know in your life, friends and family, and please do that. So I can't take something that is really depressing and a public health emergency and turn it around into something positive. But I can say that as we empower ourselves to learn about this and to see ourselves as actors in the struggle to combat it, that this is not just me and Saru and you now from the St. Louis Film Festival. It's like it is all of us. And in the same way that I would say Joe Biden is calling forth for us to behave from our better angels, that's part of what the call out of this film is to educate yourself and then educate others about a situation that is hidden in plain sight from all of us. And my ask is that, we all become emissaries of a vision of a world with greater economic equity as part of its goal.
And let's wrap up with, I should have asked this earlier, Saru. You mentioned the fact that you have a group of restaurants, a large number of restaurants now that are committed to paying a fair wage. I'm presuming that you probably have on your website the names of those restaurants. Is that true? Can you guide us to where, if you want to be supportive as a consumer, the restaurants that within your area, how can you find out who's doing the right thing?
Yeah, we're actually right now revamping the website, but highroadrestaurants.org is the place to go. That's where the list of employers will be, that you can find that are doing the right thing, providing livable wages, transitioning to one fair wage.
High Road, all spelled out
Yeah.
HIGH.
highroadrestaurants.org.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you again so much for taking the time out of, as they say, no doubt very busy days in order to expand on, we're almost at the point where we're all close to the running length of the film. So it's quite a supplement, but I think people will have learned a tremendous amount between the documentary itself and then this follow-up conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Take care.